bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 125. We wanted to pause and take a moment to talk about, in this episode, a reformer who passed away a couple weeks ago. Has been an impact in the lives of both Brian and I, many people. This is John Taylor Gatto. He is a former public school teacher in the state of New York. He was an award-winning teacher. And what's amazing about this guy is not only was he a product of this system, he was lavished with praise. He was given, Teacher of the Year award by the state, by New York City. He was in the system, I think, for like 25, 30 years before he finally quit with an op-ed titled, "I Quit, I Think." And it was an expose into the system saying he'd come to the realization that he was actually hurting children. And it wasn't so much him, it was the system itself. So he went on to write a number of books about public schooling, about its history, about the way it was structured. And these books are very popular, very well done. One of them in particular, titled "Dumbing Us Down," was very inspirational and helpful for me as I was newly married and trying to figure out what we would do with our children. The subtitle of that book is "The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling." And this is not to impugn any specific teacher. He himself was a teacher, points out that there are great people in the system. The problem is the system itself is designed a certain way that, notwithstanding there being very well-intentioned people within it, it produces a certain outcome by and large for the people who are shuffled through it. Brian, excuse me. We just did an interview with someone named Ben. I'm going to heretofore call you Ben. Brian,
I accept the new name. Thank you.
Talk to us about your observations of John Taylor Gatto. Did you ever interview him, by the way, on your show?
I don't think I ever got a chance to interview him.
Okay.
He was in demand, so he was not the easiest guy to get a hold of. But John Taylor Gatto, there was a time when my wife and I were very hardcore homeschoolers. And one of the reasons we became homeschoolers was because of his book, The Underground History of American Education. Now, since that time, my wife has gone on and become a public school teacher. So when we talk about government education or government schooling, that can be kind of a tender topic in our home. But I will be forever indebted to John Taylor Gatto for filling in the blanks as to how did we get to where we are today in terms of where government-run education is the norm, and anything outside of that is considered, a little bit marginal, maybe even fringe by a lot of people. And he really, I think he gave this good, cohesive explanation of, in the founders' time, even though they talked about the importance of public education, they weren't talking about a top-down, centralized system.
Yeah.
But he talked about the way that it came to us. He talked about how it was sold to the states. I mean, how do you get states to sign on to something as drastic as compulsory education? Parents, send your children to this government school, or we will put you in jail, which it did. And so that was very helpful for me. I agree with everything you had said earlier, too, about there really are a lot of great people in the system, and sometimes some really great things happen, but it's in spite of the system and generally not because of it. And so if you've ever had any doubts about the system, John Taylor Gatto is probably one of the better sources you can go to understand how did it get to be what it is today.
And part of me feels like when you have reformers, when you have critics, they're far more credible when they kind of come from the system. Right, so think of let's say a Scientologist, right? If you have people on the site who just say, well, that's weird, and they criticize it, that's one thing. But when you have a former Scientologist who comes out and kind of reveals all, right, has this expose of here's what it was like to be a Scientologist, that is far more interesting and credible because you are getting a behind-the-scenes peek as to how things run. That's someone with a lot more credibility to talk about, in that case, Scientology. So here we have not just a homeschooler who doesn't like public schooling or some, critic from the sidelines. This is someone whose entire professional career came from the system. He understands very well what it was like. It reminds me of there was a gal a few years ago who became the valedictorian. I believe this was also in New York. And so she stands up for her speech. and in front of all of the administrators, teachers, parents, and basically criticizes the whole system and say, look, I'm kind of the product of what a good student should be, but I have no clue what I want to do with my life. I believe her name was Erica Goldson. I'm actually going to look that up. It's a fantastic speech. We'll link to it on the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/125. But she basically says, I have no idea what I want to do with my life, because while all my friends were out developing hobbies and following their passions and interests, I was doing extra credit because I wanted to get a good grade, and I thought everything was about that specific outcome. And so even though I'm like schooled and I've gone through the system and I am its kind of core, chief, primary, praiseworthy product, I'm terrified for the future. Whereas all my other friends who kind of did okay, they kind of know what they want to do, and they're already pursuing those things, notwithstanding having all these assignments and tests and so forth. And so when you have someone like her who's the grade A product of the public schooling system saying that, that's very credible, and you got to take a step back and say, whoa, right? Like what's happening here? So too, I think with Gatto, where you have this guy who was a teacher for decades, and then he kind of talks about it. To me, it's a lot more credible.
No, I would agree. No one can accuse him of simply having been some outsider looking in, trying to, use conjecture to say what was going on. He was there, and he was actually lauded as an exceptional teacher. If he had always been seen as a troublemaker, I think that might undermine him a little bit. But no, this guy was the teacher of the year. He was exemplary. Other teachers, look at Mr. Gatto, this is who you want to be like. And yet he still came to that realization. And I don't know, do you know anything about where his awakening began?
I don't. And I think a lot of it, as I've read some of his other essays and stuff, was as a byproduct of merely seeing what was happening to his students. And he was also doing things a bit differently. I recall reading in one of his books that he would take his students and kind of go on these like huge field trips without permission kind of thing to kind of give them different experience and exposure that he felt important, but the system was not set up to encourage him or require him to do. And so he'd get into trouble here and there because he was doing things a bit differently. When you read his books, you really get the kind of eye-opening understanding of just how different he thought and how important that was. So there's so many quotes we can get into. We're just going to share a few and talk a bit about him today. I've got this lengthy list here of some of my favorite quotes from him. I'm going to start with one. So he says, by preventing a free market in education, remember, of course, that his chief complaint was against compulsory education, as Brian points out, saying, like, we're going to coerce you all into following the specific schooling model. So he says that by preventing a free market in education, a handful of social engineers backed by the industries that profit from compulsory schooling, teacher colleges, textbook publishers, material suppliers, and others, has ensured that most of our children will not have an education, even though they may be thoroughly schooled. And I remember first reading that about a decade ago and thinking, oh, that's kind of a huge criticism. Like, I came through the, public school system, and I turned out fine. But as evidence of what he's talking about, we see all the time these videos of high school seniors being asked basic questions, let alone just your average voter on the street. You see these man on the street videos all the time. But I've seen so many of these videos where high school seniors are asked just basic questions about society, about policy, about, math, whatever, and they're completely clueless and have no idea. And so you do wonder then where the problem comes in terms of sufficiently schooling versus adequately educating, especially if you look at the problem that's happening, Brian, right now in colleges, and that is remediation. New incoming freshmen increasingly year over year are having to be remediated. In other words, they're having to be educated on the basic fundamentals they were supposed to learn before coming to college, but they didn't learn. So they need to kind of be remediated. They need to be helped before they can fully be prepared to go into college. And so I think that gets to what Gatto's talking about here, is that you have a ton of schooling happening, maybe not so much true education.
I've got a quote for you that I hope rings some bells for you like it did for me. John Taylor Gatto said, government schooling made people dumber, not brighter, made families weaker, ruined formal religion with its hard sell exclusion of God, set the class structure in stone by dividing children into classes and setting them against one another, and has been midwife to an alarming concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a fraction of the national community. That's the 20,000-foot view, but I don't see anything he's saying there that rings untrue.
And I think that's the challenge, is that a lot of people sidestep quotes like this, as you pointed out, Brian, with your wife and with other people, to say, well, no, but I know Susie and she's helping, my kid really loves her class. But you have to take, I think, that bird's eye view to look at what is the systemic effect of this system. What is the aggregate product compared to something else? And that's the problem, is a lot of people don't compare it to anything. Maybe they compare it to public schools in another state or another country, but they're not comparing it to entirely different non-compulsory systems. And one of the things I like about what Gatto talks about is a lot of the specific criteria within schools have a net negative effect. That's not to say they're pumping out totally awful human beings or totally stupid human beings, but so here's this quote that kind of drives home the point I'm talking about. This is from his Dumbing Us Down book. He says, networks like schools are not communities, just as school training is not education. By preempting 50% of the total time of the young, by locking young people up with other young people exactly their own age, by ringing bells to start and stop work, by asking people to think about the same thing at the same time in the same way, by grading people the way we grade vegetables, and in a dozen other vile and stupid ways, network schools steal the vitality of communities and replace it with an ugly mechanism. No one survives these places with their humanity intact, not kids, not teachers, not administrators, and not parents. And I remember when I was writing my book, Passion-Driven Education, which actually Gatto did the foreword for, in there I kind of built upon what he talked about in that quote, and he talks about elsewhere in his books, and that is when you compare behavior and aspect to behavior and aspect between schools and prisons, there are a number of striking similarities where, like, you have to ask permission to go certain places, right, to even go to the bathroom. Your time is completely regimented. You are at the submission entirely of somebody else without whose consent you cannot, deviate. Your personal freedom is restricted. There are so many ways. He points out some of the problems where, and Peter Gray actually talks about a lot about this in his book, Free to Learn. Fantastic book if you're a parent of young children thinking about their education. And he talks about in other cultures, in prehistoric cultures and so forth, you had age mixing, where you had older kids interacting with younger kids. It was socializing the older kids to be compassionate because they were kind of in a mentorship role. It was helping the young kids because they would want to learn from and be around the older kids. And you didn't have animosity and bullying. If anything, you had kind of this internal support structure because inherently you would have almost this familial dynamic between old and young children who would then learn and progress together. But the system now in segmenting by age, where the only characteristic you have in common is the period of time in which you emerge from your mother's birth canal, right? Like you lump all these people in a room and you increase competitiveness and hostility because they're trying to stand apart and they're trying to rise above and create different characteristics between one another. And so you have them being other kids being put down in order to put yourself up, and the bullying dynamics within that system are substantially increased relative to other schooling systems that Peter Gray has looked at, where you have age mixing, where that dynamic is totally absent. So fascinating stuff to look at these criticisms, I think, that Gatto was talking about within the system, and see this wasn't just kind of the cantankerous, get off my lawn type stuff of a guy. This was a very scathing but focused and appropriate criticism of a system that few are willing to challenge.
And he offered solutions as well. It wasn't just, like you say, an old guy shaking his fist and turning purple at, the system that he recognized as having a number of drawbacks. He talked about what real education was. This is from an article. This is from his book, Different Kind of Teacher, Solving the Crisis of American Schooling. He said the primary goal of real education is not to deliver facts, but to guide students to the truths that will allow them to take responsibility for their lives.
Wow.
And that was for me, that was turning a corner, because about the time I remember, being acquainted with some of his work, it was the idea that education is not just mass schooling and getting everybody on the same page, getting all the widgets up to speed so we can move them off to shipping, from the factory. It's very individual. And that means some kids are going to learn, visually. Some kids learn audibly. Some are kinetic learners. There are as many different ways of learning as there are individuals. But, when you get it into an institutional setting, that can be pretty hard to remember. And everybody's treated just like they're a widget.
And for that reason, he was very critical of industrial schools. In fact, when these schools were on the rise in the mid-20th century, they were actually called industrial schools. And these are the schools we're now used to today, where you have everything in, one huge building or set of buildings. They go from place to place. It's as if you are on the factory floor and you are moving here, going there, doing this, doing that, according to schedule. And so with the rise of industrialization, you saw the progressives creating the John Deweys and Goodlads and all these people creating a schooling system that would funnel into their industrialized workforce a type of person, not just people, not just smart people, but a certain behavior set, a certain type of people who would lend themselves well to the industrialized economy that was then being built. Okay, fine. Maybe that was okay for a few decades, but we've now moved past that. We have the knowledge economy, for example. We have the service economy, the gig economy, and yet we are tying our children, the rising generation, to a very outdated model that maybe was suited for a certain era of the American economy and preparing the new workforce. But I think we've gone past that.
Let me give you an example of what that looks like, too, because I have a son who's a senior in high school, and he's been working very hard. I would not say he is one of the more dedicated students. He's a good kid. He loves to learn, but the schoolwork that's put in front of him is really not interesting, and so his grades struggle from time to time. You know what his number one concern is as he approaches graduation this coming spring?
Girls.
No, actually, I wish it was, because he's very stressed about what will I be able to do? What kind of job can I get? What kind of school should I be able to go to? And his big concern, will I be able to make enough of a living to support myself and my family? And I'm thinking, okay, so the sum of education or the sum of schooling to him is all about becoming a good worker who can get a good job and then, make a good living or make a decent living off of that. And I'm trying in my own fatherly way, as I sit there in my easy chair with my perfectly Brill-creamed hair, dispensing fatherly advice to him. I'm trying to get him to consider that maybe there's something more to your life than just simply the work that you're going to do. What if there's a larger purpose? And I think that's kind of what Gatto was getting at. It's the idea that your life should have meaning and it should have purpose. And when you meet people who have discovered meaning and purpose in their lives, I promise you, they're going to be some of the happiest, most productive people that you'll ever meet.
And I think that was one of his core criticisms. It ties into this quote I've got here where he says, "School is an essential support system for a model of social engineering that condemns most people to be subordinate stones in a pyramid that narrows as it ascends to a terminal of control." And so he's talking here about the political dynamic of the one-size-fits-all, top-down, et cetera, et cetera. However, it gets, Brian, to what you're talking about, where so many of us are cultured to think, what stone am I going to be? What cog in the machine am I going to be? There's the cartoon I remember about kids coming into class with their thought bubbles being round and the teachers going around with scissors cutting the imaginations down to a square, regimented, format. And it really speaks to what is the purpose of education. Are we preparing people to be cogs in a big machine, or do we want free thinkers, independent actors, entrepreneurs, innovators who think outside the box, who deviate from the system, who don't want to be a stone or a cog? And obviously, that's what I want for my children. And I'll share this. I shared this on Facebook the other day. What I'm excited about, as sad as I am to see Gatto go, because the guy had a brilliant mind, and I'm so glad that he wrote so much to preserve a lot of these ideas to help many people as he helped me. I mentioned that he wrote the foreword for Passion-Driven Education. I'm actually working on another book that's going to come out in the spring or summer called Skip College, and it's all about finding new opportunities in the new economy that don't require you to have all the debt and the distraction and the delays that come with sitting in a classroom for 4 more years. And Gatto was working on a chapter for that book talking about kind of the history of the universities and the colleges and why did things end up the way they did, he actually finished that chapter 3 days before he passed away. And so this was his last writing, his last work of his life that's going to be coming out in this book in a few months. So I'm very humbled by that. I'm very excited. If you guys have not heard of John Taylor Gatto before, we will link to a couple of his books that are definitely worth getting. We've only shared, scratched the surface here. As he expounds on these ideas, that's where the power really comes in, not just in the quote itself, but in the context behind it, the thinking around it. Definitely take advantage of picking up a book or two of his or searching online. He's got some really interesting videos and speeches that he's given. Remarkable life, good guy for really trying to help children and both within the system, but then trying to help critique the system and help a certain type of people get out of the system who are better served by not being on that conveyor belt. So just a little parting thoughts here to celebrate the life of a great guy. We hope you guys all learn a little bit more about him. We will link to some of these resources on the show notes page today, societyandthestate.com/125. Stick around, Ben / Brian, for the next episode. We're going to be talking actually to Ben Taylor, whose interview we recorded just before this one, to talk about the future and artificial intelligence and how it plays into it. This is a guy whose insights you don't want to miss. So make sure you are subscribed, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.